Welcome to Post-Colonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and happy 2024 to all of you. I am now going to start my concluding conversations about Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. We are on chapter 4, and in today's video, I will talk about his conclusion to the 4 anti-dialogical practices and concepts that he discusses in this chapter and that we have extensively talked about. And after I've covered this and talked about it to you, then I will move on towards the end of this chapter and end of this book to discussing the 4 dialogical methods, concepts, and practices that he concludes the book with. Now, you all know I started this project about 3 years ago. And if you watch my earlier video, you can see that I was then sitting in my office at my previous job, and I had access to all the books in my office. Now I'm at a different place, a different job, maybe a different life in so many ways, but my engagement with Freire is still the same. And over these 3 years, to be very honest, my own personal understanding of Freire has grown thanks to you, because as I prepare to talk about a section of the book, it makes me reflect more about the book. It helps me make connections with other materials that I have read. And overall, this experience of covering the whole book so far, I know it might have been useful to you, but it has been absolutely transformative for me personally as an educator and as a human being in this world. So, as always, I'll first go and read a part of chapter 4 and then come back and talk about it. So here we go. Before proceeding to analyze the theory of dialogical action, it is essential to discuss briefly how the revolutionary leadership group is formed and some of the historical and sociological consequences for the revolutionary process. Usually, this leadership group is made up of men and women who, in one way or another, have belonged to the social strata of the dominators. At a certain point in their existential experience, under certain historical conditions, these leaders renounce the class to which they belong and join the oppressed in an act of solidarity, or so one would hope. Whether or not this adherence results from a scientific analysis of reality, it represents, when authentic, an act of love and true commitment. Joining the oppressed requires going to them and communicating with them. The people must find themselves in the emerging leaders, and the latter must find themselves in the people. The leaders who have emerged necessarily reflect the contradiction of the dominant elites communicated to them by the oppressed, who may not yet, however, clearly perceive their own state of oppression or critically recognize their relationship of antagonism to the oppressors. They may still be in the position previously termed adhesion to the oppressor. On the other hand, it is possible that due to certain objective historical conditions, they have already reached a relatively clear perception of their state of oppression. In the first case, the adhesion or partial adhesion of the people to the oppressor makes it impossible for them to repeat Fanon's point, to locate him outside themselves. In the second case, they can locate the oppressor and can thus critically recognize their relationship of antagonism to him. In the first case, the oppressor is housed within the people, and their resulting ambiguity makes them fearful of freedom. They resort stimulated by the oppressor to magical explanations or a false view of God to whom they fatalistically transfer the responsibility for their oppressed state. It is extremely unlikely that these self-mistrustful, downtrodden, hopeless people will seek their own liberation, an act of rebellion which they may view as a disobedient violation of the will of God, as an unwanted confrontation with destiny. Hence, the oft-emphasized necessity of posing as problems the myths fed to the people by the oppressors. In the second case, when the people have reached a relatively clear picture of oppression which leads them to localize the oppressor outside themselves, they take up the struggle to surmount the contradiction in which they are caught. At this moment, they overcome the distance between class necessity and class consciousness. Yes. The revolutionary leaders unfortunately and involuntarily become the contradiction of the people. In the second case, the emerging leaders receive from the people sympathetic and almost instantaneous support, which tends to increase during the process of revolutionary action. The leaders go to the people in a spontaneously dialogical manner. There is an almost immediate empathy between the people and the revolutionary leaders. Their mutual commitment is almost instantly sealed. In fellowship, they consider themselves co-equal contradictions of the dominant elites. From this point on, the established practice of dialogue between people and leaders is nearly unshakable. That dialogue will continue when power is reached and the people will know that they have come to power. This sharing in no way diminishes the spirit of struggle, courage, capacity for love, or daring required of the revolutionary leaders. Fidel Castro and his comrades, whom many at the time termed irresponsible adventurers, an eminently dialogical leadership group, identified with the people who endured the brutal violence of the Batista dictatorship. This adherence was not easy. It required bravery on the part of the leaders to love the people sufficiently to be willing to sacrifice themselves for them. It required courageous witness by the leaders to recommence after each disaster, moved by undying hope in a future victory, which, because forged together with the people, would belong not to the leaders alone, but to the leaders and the people, or to the people including the leaders. Fidel gradually polarized the adherents of the Cuban people, who due to their historical experience had already begun to break their adhesion to the oppressor. This drawing away from the oppressor led the people to objectify him and to see themselves as his contradiction. So it was that Fidel never entered into contradiction with the people. The occasional desertions or betrayals registered by Che Guevara in his Relato de la Guerra Revolución, in which he also refers to the many who adhered, were to be expected. Thus, due to certain historical conditions, the movement by the revolutionary leaders to the people is either horizontal, so that leaders and people form one body in contradiction to the oppressor, or it is triangular, with the revolutionary leaders occupying the vertex of the triangle in contradiction to the oppressors and to the oppressed as well. As we have seen, the latter situation is forced on the leaders when the people have not yet achieved a critical perception of oppressive reality. Almost never, however, does a revolutionary leadership group perceive that it constitutes a contradiction to the people. Indeed, this perception is painful, and the resistance may serve as a defense mechanism. After all, it is not easy for leaders who have emerged through adherence to the oppressed to recognize themselves as being in contradiction with those to whom they adhered. It is important to recognize this reluctance when analyzing certain forms of behavior on the part of revolutionary leaders who involuntarily become a contradiction, although not antagonist, of the people. In order to carry out the revolution, revolutionary leaders undoubtedly require the adherence of the people. When leaders who constitute a contradiction to the people seek this adherence and find rather a certain aloofness and mistrust, they often regard this reaction as indicating an inherent defect on the part of the people. They interpret a certain historical moment of the people's consciousness as evidence of their intrinsic deficiency. Since the leaders need the adherence of the people so that the revolution can be achieved, but at the same time mistrust the mistrustful people, they are tempted to utilize the same procedures used by the dominant elites to oppress. Rationalizing their lack of confidence in the people, the leaders say that it is impossible to dialogue with the people before taking power, thus opting for the anti-dialogical theory of action. Thenceforward, just like the dominant elites, they try to conquer the people. They become messianic. They use manipulation and carry out cultural invasion. By advancing along these paths, the paths of oppression, they will not achieve revolution. Or if they do, it will not be authentic revolution. The role of revolutionary leadership under any circumstances, but especially so in those described, is to consider seriously, even as they act, the reason for any attribute of mistrust on the part of the people, and to seek out true avenues of communion with them, ways of helping the people to help themselves critically perceive the reality which oppresses them. Alienated consciousness is dual, ambiguous, full of fear and mistrust. In his diary about the struggle in Bolivia, Che Guevara refers several times to the lack of peasant participation. The peasant mobilization does not exist except for informative duties which annoy us somewhat. They are neither very rapid nor very efficient. They can be neutralized. Complete lack of incorporation of the peasants, although they are losing their fear of us and we are succeeding in winning their admiration, it is a slow and patient task. The internalization of the oppressor by the dominated consciousness of the peasants explains their fear and their inefficiency. The behavior and reactions of the oppressed, which lead the oppressor to practice cultural invasion, should evoke from the revolutionary a different theory of action. What distinguishes revolutionary leaders from the dominant elite is not only their objectives, but their procedures. If they act in the same way, the objectives become identical. It is as self-contradictory for the dominant elites to pose human-world relations as problems to the people as it is for the revolutionary leaders not to do so. Let us now analyze the theory of dialogical cultural action and attempt to apprehend its constituent elements. Okay, so first of all, thank you so much for staying with me for what is a pretty long reading. But my hope is that as you wade through these videos, my reading of them as you read along is another aid in, critically reading the book. So I will kind of break down my discussion of what I just read. If you go back to the text, he's setting up two existential conditions vis-a-vis the revolutionary leadership and their relationship with the people. Because he's trying to now figure out and teach us what is the nature of relationship between the so-called leaders of the revolution and people, and how do these leaders emerge, but how do they must commune with the people. So in the very beginning, he is teaching us, which we previously also discussed, that maybe the leadership that has emerged is from the bourgeois class. Maybe they were previously their attachment was with the dominant group. And at a certain point in their lives, maybe they decided to disalign themselves from the oppressor group and join the people. Now, there is a whole process of it, which we discussed in chapter 2 and 3, where people who leave the oppressor group and join the people, there is a certain methodology for them to become part of the people. And the most important of them is, of course, that they must not come with this mindset that we have all the answers, you just listen to us. They must learn with the people, right? That's a precondition. But in this leader and led relationship, both sides have to dislodge certain things. Those who are in the leadership position or consider themselves as revolutionary leaders must dislodge from within their consciousness any idea of their adhesion or attachment to the dominant group that they have left, right? Their actions must be guided by the people and their needs and their wants and their aspirations. But in this dialogue between the people and the leadership, there are two kinds of ramifications or two kinds of instances that Freire is discussing over here. One is that leaders are talking to people who are first in a state where they have not yet dislodged from within themselves the oppressive order that structure their consciousness. Hence, there is a reference to Fanon, right? Black skin, white masks, right? This whole idea of how is it that the black subject or the colonized subject internalizes the system in which they exist as the natural system, right? And so for Fanon, the way to achieving consciousness that is free of the colonial influence is for the native to first acknowledge, look at the reality objectively, look at the oppression objectively, and then stop thinking as a victim and stop thinking in terms of the logic of the oppressive system and develop their own group and individual consciousness. So if the leaders and people are communicating in a way where the leaders themselves have not dislodged the privileges and the ideas that they had when they were part of the dominant group, and if the people have not dislodged the oppressive system that resides inside of them, then the relationship will be inauthentic. The second instance is when both sides, when the leaders have determined that all their actions, their statements, their praxis has to be informed by the people and with the people, and when they have people who have autonomously objectified the reality. When you objectify the reality, what you're doing is you're detaching it from yourself and looking at it critically. We did this in chapter 3, right, where he develops the pedagogical practices. So that is an ideal condition, because then you have people who have freed themselves of the logic of oppression that resided in their soul, and you have leaders who are looking at the world not top down, but with the people. And so the revolutionary battle then is so-called authentic because both constituencies, the leaders and the people, are one. Their goals are one. And at no point do the leaders say that give us your support now and we will then deliver once we have power. Power must be accomplished after the people are ready and after the leaders are ready. This is crucial in revolutionary praxis. Because what's at stake if you look at the reading? If leaders have not dislodged their privileged ways of looking at the people, then they will keep blaming the people, right? They're like, we are trying to do everything, but well, the people are not up to it. They don't want change. I mean, you saw that Che Guevara quote where he is talking about the peasants, but he's at least looking at the material causes of why the peasants are not engaged, because he's like, they are not ready. So part of any revolutionary process is this dialogic relationship between the leadership and the peasants, or the oppressed, to reach a point where people have crossed that threshold, where they have dislodged the oppressive order from their souls, looked at it critically, and dismissed it, and they are ready for change. That is why the book is not revolutionary praxis, it's pedagogy of the oppressed. How do we use education informed by the people, right, with research, to create conditions in a classroom, formal or informal, where people first become aware of the logic of the very system within which their identities are created. Another thing that's being discussed here is the role of religion and fatalism, right? How do we encounter people who basically say, this is our lot in life. There isn't much we can do. And we have read that throughout the book, the process of dislodging that kind of attachment to a fatalistic explanation of the world, right? So if you look at chapter 3, the research has to be, what is the thematic universe in which people live? Understanding it from the point of view of the people, and then informing our pedagogy by laying bare the structure of that thematic universe. So this reading that we just did, right, is a cautionary tale for revolutionary leadership, to not to assume that they have the answers, and to not approach the people as if the leaders have the solutions and people must follow, and to not think of the revolution as a tool that when it happens, when the order has been shifted, then we will implement the policies that would free the people. The revolutionary praxis must start with people having already crossed a threshold where they are aware of the oppression, and they are aware that it is they themselves who, along with their leadership, will change the things to better. And in all stages, making sure that they themselves do not become the oppressors, right? So there is a great example of Fidel Castro, right? Because in the beginning of the revolution, their actions were absolutely informed by the people, right? And they had the complete solidarity with the people. It is later that the revolution becomes corrupted, right? It becomes autocratic. So that's what he's trying to obviate, or trying to teach us how to approach it, right? Revolutionary processes, of course, are messy, but at least he's giving us a blueprint that forestalls and forces us to think what not to do in preparing the people, in working in communion with the people. And the most important thing that comes across through this reading and through this chapter is that there has to be dialogue, communion, love between the people and those who claim to be their leaders. Also, in what I just read was a reference to adhesion to the dominant system, which was previously mentioned in one of the previous chapters. So, adhesion is basically when unconsciously people or the leaders are still caught within the logic of the oppressive order, when they adhere to its logic. So, part of the project, revolutionary and educational, is to diminish and eliminate that adhesion to the logic of the oppressive system out of which we are trying to break. Then there are instances where I just read where he constantly keeps mentioning that leaders must not be in a state of contradiction with the people, which simply stated is state of contradiction would be when the leaders, their loyalties still adhere, maybe imperceptibly, to the previous order that had structured them, and they see people only as a tool. That's a contradictory relationship. A cohesive relationship, a relationship of equality, communion, or love would be where the leaders are at the same level as the people. Now, for that, two things have to happen. Leaders have to come down and learn with the people, and people have now learned and been educated to be autonomous thinking subjects for themselves, right? As we previously discussed, subjects of their own destiny, right? So what can we learn from this? Because from here, he will move on to give us 4 registers under which we can discuss the dialogical ways of dealing with oppression. We have so far covered the anti-dialogical practices, how they are perpetuated by the dominant group, and we are now moving into how to develop dialogical practices. These dialogical practices are necessary for 2 things. One, for people to reach their consciousness, to come to consciousness of their own oppression, right? Which they might have internalized because of their beliefs in religion, because of fatalism, right? And leaders to be conscious that they cannot postpone the change after the revolution. The change must be part of the revolutionary process. And this is what distinguishes authentic revolutionary change to populism. Populist leaders will use popular slogans, but what they say is, don't ask us any questions right now, give us the power, and then we will change things. That invariably always does not deliver, right? Because people are being used as tools. You can see that in any country, any populist leader, right? So the idea is to have dialogical practices, because a dialogue presupposes interaction between 2 equals, and then through that dialogical praxis bring about revolutionary change. So I'm going to stop here, and in the next video then we will start talking about the 4 concepts or dialogical practices that he discusses, that he considers absolutely necessary for revolutionary change. That's all for today. Thank you so much for being in my life. Thank you so much for your support, and thank you so much for your interest in this, what I consider to be a highly important project. Thank you. Stay safe, take care of each other, and I will now see you next time. Until then, as always, peace and love.